Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. It's Tuesday, September 12th, and I'm your host, Cara Santa Maria. And I'm really excited about this week's show. I'm going to be chatting with Kathryn Miles. She's a journalist and the author of her new book, Quakeland, On the Road to America's Next Devastating Earthquake. And of course, this is a very prescient book, and we talk a lot about that. And just bear in mind, when you hear me talk about Nepal and Southeast Asia and the terrible tsunamis occurring there, and of course, the Hurricane Harvey in Houston, there's one thing you won't hear me talk about, and that's Hurricane Irma in Florida. That's simply because we recorded this episode prior to Irma even taking shape. I'm not intentionally leaving that out. It just, it hadn't occurred yet when we sat down to chat. So just keep that in mind. But in the meantime, I want to thank those of you who made Talk Nerdy possible this week. First, I want to thank Rob Schreck for your generous support. Rob signed up to support the show on a somewhat recurring basis through the PayPal portal, which he reached by going to www.carasantamaria.com and then clicking through. But of course, the more popular way to support the show is through Patreon, and you can find my Patreon page at patreon.com/talknerdy. Some of the big supporters this week are Phil T-Bear, Timothy Glover, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Jeffrey Perez, Genji Keene, Charles Payette, Jonathan Wright, Christian Jeffrey, Stuart Ogue, The Honorable Husband, Jafe, Gabriel Felipe Jaramillo Gonzalez, Brian Holden, and of course, Jeffrey Sewell. I want to thank you guys so very much. And there are a bunch of other ways to support the show. First and foremost, just telling people about it, spreading the word, sharing the episodes on social media. That is incredibly helpful. But you can also rate it and review it on iTunes or any other RSS catcher where you listen to the show. And of course, what else can you do? Oh, you can shop in the Talk Nerdy store. It's fun. I have t-shirts, and they're all back in stock in every size. So yeah, you can check that out there. Okay, guys. Well, I really want to dive into the episode this week. It's a really, I think, important and actually fun too. We have a good time, but an important chat with Kathryn Miles. She wrote a book, as I mentioned before, called Quakeland, On the Road to America's Next Devastating Earthquake, in which she journeys around the United States and learns a lot about earthquake science, about how earthquakes are occurring, and about both sort of the historical, natural history of the earthquake, but also how our own activities are inducing many more earthquakes than we ever used to have. So I'm super thrilled for you guys to hear it and to learn more from her. So without any further ado, here she is, Kathryn Miles. Well, Kathryn, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'm really excited to talk about your new book, Quakeland, On the Road to America's Next Devastating Earthquake. And I think right now, we are actually recording this on Wednesday, August 30th, to air a little bit later. But right now, this is really relevant in a lot of ways because we are in the wake of some serious disasters that are happening right now, both in Houston, Texas, but also in Southeast Asia, in Nepal and Bangladesh. And so I think that sort of Mother Nature's fury is on a lot of people's minds, but more specifically, and I think you touch on this very well in your book, how our own actions as human beings are exacerbating the fury of Mother Nature. So thank you for, I mean, we didn't plan on it, but for chatting to me during this really, I think, relevant time.
Yeah, and the sort of tragic irony of all of this is the idea for the book actually came out of my previous book, which is about Superstorm Sandy and looking at the degree to which we could deal with changing weather and climate change and hurricanes in terms of our sort of degraded infrastructure. So this is sort of writ large, the truth of how ill-prepared we are for any natural disaster, whether it's a hurricane or an earthquake.
Oh, yeah. And so you had obviously all of that background when you were doing your research on Sandy and, in a way that really feeds in to this story of Quakeland. Let's talk a little bit about earthquakes. I want to start with that because I live in Los Angeles, but I grew up in Texas, so I'm much more aware of tornadoes. That is sort of the natural disaster that people in North Texas, at least, deal with for the most part. South Texas obviously has the hurricane risk as well. But now that I live in LA, there is a real earthquake risk. And I've been in a couple of earthquakes, and they were like, meh. When I lived in New York, I lived over the subway. They felt about the same. You know what I mean? And so I don't think that I'm truly prepared for what a devastating earthquake could really do.
Well, and as I say in the book, none of us really are. I mean, the last earthquake of note that our country experienced was that 1989 Loma Prieta, or the World Series earthquake, which also was the first truly televised earthquake. And, that's been long enough that our sort of collective consciousness has really forgotten what they mean and what we need to do to prepare for them. And what we're finding is that increasingly as a species, we're becoming particularly adept at starting earthquakes. And so not only is the paradigm sort of foggy in our minds, but we're changing the paradigm every day so that we see earthquakes in places like North Texas where we didn't have them before.
Oh, yeah, it's fascinating, but it's also pretty scary. Before we get into these sort of man-made or human-produced earthquakes, maybe we should take a second to just, define what an earthquake is. I think we all know what an earthquake is generally. It's like when the earth quakes. But why does it happen? And why historically has it only happened in specific parts of the world?
And, one of the big surprises for me with this book was just how little even the very best scientists, the seismologists and geophysicists know about earthquakes and what they are and why they happen. We do know that there are a variety of different places in which tectonic plates meet, and they can cause a couple of different types of earthquakes. So the strongest of these are what are called subduction earthquakes, and that's what we saw that created the 2011 Fukushima disaster. It's what created that giant Indian Ocean tsunami, things like that. We have a subduction zone in the U.S. in the Pacific Northwest. We have another one in the Caribbean. So those are capable of those really strong, really intense earthquake and tsunami producing quakes. We also have some in places that people are probably familiar with, like the San Andreas fault zone, where we have two plates moving alongside each other. But what we're also finding is that we have these intraplate earthquakes, where in the heartland of the United States, for instance, there are these tiny fissures, and these tiny fissures are kind of akin to what you might see if you have a pebble hit the windshield of your car, and so you might have it hit, and you have sort of a little ding, and then by the time you get back from the grocery store, that ding has become sort of a spider web crack. And the Earth is capable of the same sort of thing. So we have these tiny little weaknesses all over the planet, and what happens is, as pressure changes, those little weaknesses can't withstand it, and so they literally break. And when they break, what we have is this seismic activity that we call an earthquake.
And so that seismic activity, it really is just powerful energy that's being released from these massive tectonic plates, or these, within the dirt, right?
Yeah, so it's about pressure, right? Pressure is always building, and then eventually the pressure, if you think about, for instance, blowing up a balloon, right? We can blow up the balloon, the pressure grows, and then eventually it breaks the balloon. And that's what happens inside the Earth too. So as we shift pressures, as we put additional pressure in, as we take pressure away, eventually, we hit this sort of break point for any rock. And the break point is very different within, even inches of each other.
Gotcha. And so, throughout all of human history, this is something that has occurred. And I would assume that, like many other natural disasters, or even not disasters, but just sort of seemingly random events. I mean, I was just at the total solar eclipse last week, and that was just mind-blowing, right? But I can only imagine what it was like for people hundreds or thousands of years ago who were like, what is happening? There's a hole in the sky. Why is this happening to me? I would assume that earthquakes have similar lore built around them, and similar kind of stories that built up in a more pre-scientific era.
Absolutely. And, I had the same exact thought when I was looking at eclipse, and I thought, if I didn't have the scientific explanation in front of me, I would think that the world was ending, or I would think that some sort of evil deity was sort of exercising his or her wrath. And the thing about earthquakes that really distinguish them from other natural disasters is that utter lack of warning. So whereas, for instance, with a hurricane, we would see the skies cloud up, we would see the storm approach. Even with a volcanic eruption, oftentimes you would see, for instance, the smoke build, the sort of stench of the sulfur and things like that. Earthquakes they always will occur with almost no warning. And so the idea that the very ground that you stand on, the ground that you believe is solid and secure, all of a sudden becomes liquid without warning, has created a whole host of mythologies and aspects of religion throughout cultures. And it remains, I think, a particularly sort of traumatic experience for us because we don't have that warning. We don't have that notion that, hey, something is coming.
Yeah, that's true. Back when I was a reporter with HuffPost, I came on a couple episodes of HuffPost Live. I had done a couple stories about earthquake science, but really what we had focused on was the idea of these early warning detection systems and how there's a lot of sort of hoaxes out there. There's a lot of pseudoscience out there, but then there are some legitimate detection systems and more warning systems being used through cell phone texting. But when we talk about warning systems, we're talking about the initial wave has already struck, and we're just trying to let people know before the secondary wave comes through. Like it's seconds of warning, not minutes, not hours, and definitely not days of warning.
Yeah. And when you talk to experts in this field, they're really quick to distinguish between this idea of prediction and forecasting and early warning. And so far, there has been no sort of verifiable means of predicting an earthquake. But these early warning systems are incredibly useful and really helpful. And if you look around the world, countries, even developing countries like the Philippines and Mexico, have these fairly robust early warning systems that, because of the way in which waves travel, there's two main waves associated with an earthquake. They travel at different speeds. So seismometers are able to register that first wave, correctly identify it as an earthquake, know that second wave is coming, and give people a lead time of, say, 30 seconds, a minute, sometimes even as much as 90 seconds to say, take cover. And that can be enough time to get under a table, to stop a train, to close a tunnel, to keep a plane from landing. And so it really can be the difference between life and death for people.
Oh, absolutely. And that's so important because, of course, we can't feel that first wave. We have no kind of personal intrinsic knowledge that it's coming. But if a siren goes off, if our cell phones, which are always in our pockets, give us a warning pop-up that says, take cover or make sure you get out from any place with glass or with breakables around you. That's huge. That's incredibly helpful because the destructive powers of earthquakes it's kind of unfathomable, isn't it?
It is. And they are always going to remain the least predictable of these natural phenomenon. And we know that our country in multiple locations is overdue for a significant one. And there's nothing we'll be able to do to change that. But we can invest in this idea of early warning systems, and we can invest in some of these sort of remediation techniques that, as you say, will keep people safe. And I think that that's really, as a country, what we need to take responsibility to do, to really sort of say, look, it's a priority for us to invest in this sort of front-loaded preventative action rather than sort of the aftermath cleanup, which historically is where we tend to sort of put our time and energy. And I'd really like to see us move it to that front end. And that's true for any natural disaster.
Yeah, it's true for a lot of things in life, right? I mean, as the saying goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that really is true when you look at the risk-benefit analysis and the economic analysis, that if you're well prepared for disasters, you can make decisions that will prevent death, that will prevent property damage, that will prevent loss of economic kind of resilience. And that's so, so necessary, especially which we'll get to in just a second, but as our human activities are increasing the frequency of these events, we are having to really look at them in a different way than we did in the past. But I wanted to point to one thing you mentioned then. You said the phrase, a lot of experts would say that we're long overdue. So I want to make sure to clarify a little bit for people listening that although we can't forecast or predict when an earthquake will strike or how violent it will be, there are some models that give a general idea of when seismic activity is due, aren't there?
That's right. And it's a great clarification that you're making. The best means we have right now of trying to anticipate when an earthquake will be is based on historic return rate. And so there are scientists who specialize in this sort of paleogeology, where they can go back and do this sort of post-mortem analysis of faults, and they can also look at historical documents, like, for instance, newspapers back, a couple hundred years, and they can sort of chart the rate at which earthquakes have happened in different times. And so, what we know from this historic analysis, for instance, is that for the past, say, 1,000 years, New York City has experienced a moderate earthquake of about a 5.0. On the average of every 100 years, sometimes a little less. The last one was in the 1880s. And so, seismologists say, listen, we feel fairly confident that it occurs with some regularity. It's about 40 years late. So we could probably expect it any time. But that is, that's a sort of risk analysis assessment. And it really isn't, as you mentioned, it's not empirical. It's not something you can bank on. It's just sort of our best guess.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, we have much, I don't want to say better, because it's a different kind of science, and obviously there are different analyses that go into it, but it's maybe a little easier for us to predict the landfall of a hurricane, for example, or maybe it's just that we have a little bit more lead time coming up when we're predicting something like a hurricane. And what we've noticed recently, as we are living through these really violent events, at first they said, oh, this is once in every 100 years. Like maybe when Katrina hit, this is a 100-year storm. Like we remember Galveston and we haven't recovered from that. And then when Sandy hit, it was like, oh, this is like a once in every 50-year storm. And then now that Harvey is just wreaking havoc on the southern, on the Gulf of Mexico shoreline, but this is like a once in every 25. It's these really horrific events are happening more and more frequently. And many people, you can't say Hurricane Sandy is absolutely, or Hurricane Harvey is absolutely the outcome of climate change. It's much more complicated than that. And the models require just a lot of math and a lot of data to go into them. But I think generally speaking, climatologists feel pretty confident saying, with warmer waters, with higher waters, we are going to see more violent storms. We're going to see more storms, and the storms are going to be more violent. This is a direct outcome of human activity. And you see something similar, right, with earthquakes. Right.
And breaking this down just a little bit, that sort of that modeling that we can do with hurricanes. And again, same thing when I was doing the research for the Superstorm Sandy book, again, the hurricane experts at the National Hurricane Center kept saying to me, like, look, we're not very good at this, and we don't really know enough to do this and really feel confident in our predictions. Wow. And yet, when you think about, as you mentioned, the sheer amount of data that they have, that they can deal with. I mean, we have both NOAA and the National Guard regularly flying these weather reconnaissance planes into the heart of these hurricanes, sending out these data gathering devices called dropsons that are able to gather information about wind speed and barometric pressure and humidity and all of these sorts of things. And that's what's used largely to generate these models. We can't do any of that for earthquakes because we don't know that they're coming. And so really, the only real science that these geophysicists and these seismologists have is this sort of after the fact science. We have very few seismometers. We have very few devices, and we don't know where to put them. I mean, we can put them on San Andreas and feel fairly confident that there's going to be some activity, but where on San Andreas? And so that amount of data is just entirely lacking where earthquakes are concerned. And the analogy that I use in the book is, it's kind of like looking at an X-ray and saying that you're an expert on the human body. You kind of get the outline, but you're losing a ton of nuance.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. It's true that probably one of the biggest differences. We love to talk about natural disasters and lump them all together because of the outcome they have on humans. Because, of course, we always have this very sort of, I don't want to say narcissistic, but this very human-centric, this anthropocentric view of nature and of science. So, hurricanes are much like tornadoes, are much like earthquakes. No, they're nothing like each other. But because they cause property damage and people die in them, we think, okay, these are similar phenomena. But one of the biggest differences, other than the fact that an earthquake is not a weather phenomenon, is that it's fast. It's so much faster than a hurricane, for example. It's much more on the timescale of a tornado, or even faster than that.
That's right. And far more destructive, and far more far-reaching destruction. And you mentioned this idea of induced quakes. And what we're seeing there is this huge paradigm shift with everything that we know in terms of understanding how they work, because now we're seeing earthquakes that aren't on known faults and aren't in fault zones like the San Andreas. We're seeing earthquakes in places like Texas, like Oklahoma, like Arkansas. And that's a completely different sort of geological phenomenon that we're trying to have to address as well.
Yeah, let's really talk about that, because I think for a lot of people, at least in the back of my mind, I've always known that, okay, like fracking seems to be linked to higher earthquakes, and it seems to be linked to earthquakes in areas that don't have known faults. So when I think of like human-induced earthquakes, I think of Oklahoma, and I think of these fracking fields in Oklahoma. Is fracking directly linked to earthquakes, A? And B, is it the only human activity that can induce earthquakes?
So answering B first, absolutely not. And one of the huge surprises for me in this book was understanding just how many different ways we can induce earthquakes. Filling a reservoir, for instance, when we, as a nation, built the Hoover Dam and filled Lake Mead, that reservoir behind the Hoover Dam, that simple process of filling that reservoir caused over 10,000 earthquakes over the course of about 5 years.
Wow. Is that just because of the weight of the water and the pressure that it put on the ground below?
Exactly. It's both the weight and the fact that the water seeped. And as the water seeped, obviously changed the pressure inside the rock. And we saw that just a few years ago in this little town in Connecticut called Plainfield. Had never had an earthquake before. And then all of a sudden they had a swarm of about 300 of them in the course of a year. And the geologists there guessed that the reason for that was it was sort of a particularly volatile winter, and there was a great deal of sort of freezing, thawing, freezing that was happening. Water had seeped into a quarry, and as it froze and thawed and froze and thawed, changed the pressure enough that set off these hundreds of earthquakes in this little town. Apartment complexes can set off earthquakes. Mining sets off earthquakes. Tunnels sets off earthquakes. And as we become more proficient, better, and we dig deeper, we build higher, we're raising our seismicity rates, and sometimes exponentially, and in ways that we really can't understand yet. So you mentioned fracking, and the degree to which the actual act of fracking causes earthquakes is still something of a debate in the scientific community. We have evidence.
Okay, so there's not a clear decision that's been made.
So I think most people in the scientific community tend towards the side of yes, fracking does seem to induce quakes under some circumstances. And certainly going back nearly 100 years, we have evidence of oil extraction causing earthquakes. There were quite a few earthquakes off the coast of California that were caused by some of these large oil fields as the extraction happened there. What we do know with really pretty great certainty at this point is the act of wastewater injection, which is associated with fracking, seems to be sort of indisputably causing these earthquakes. And when we think of Oklahoma, what we're largely talking about in Oklahoma is this act of wastewater injection. So a variety of chemicals, including water, are injected into the ground to fracture the earth to get the natural gas out. As it comes out, that those liquids, the chemicals in the water that we injected, they come out as well. Quite a bit of sort of sedentary salt water that just exists naturally in the earth from when there was a shallow ocean over what is now Oklahoma comes out as well. So we have volumes and volumes of water that comes out. It has to go somewhere. In states like Pennsylvania, it tends to sit in these above ground settling pools, which come with other obvious problems. In states like Oklahoma, it gets re-injected into the earth. And now we're back to that balloon analogy, right? So the earth is a balloon. We're making it into a water balloon. We're filling it up. And if we fill it up too fast And with too much water, it's going to burst. And that burst, again, is that earthquake happening.
Oh, that's interesting. So in some instances, we have seen that sort of releasing pressure, like in these oil fields, like pulling things out of the earth and relieving pressure actually can induce seismic activity. But more often we see that putting more into the ground where there's already kind of a pressure threshold is just enough to cause an earthquake.
Yeah, and the fact that this is all so related to hydrology is one of the new and really exciting developments that's happening in research right now. We've known that an earthquake in one place on the planet can affect well levels somewhere on the other side of, so an earthquake in Asia can easily affect, water table levels and the levels of wells in places like Puerto Rico and New York. So we've known that there's this very sort of planetary connection in terms of water, but we haven't really understood it in terms of earthquake inducement. And now what we're really starting to understand is that sheer pressure of the water, it moves from here to there, and as it happens, we can see earthquakes happening really quite some distance from where the water originated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, gosh. It's fascinating, but it's also like worrisome, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think the real issue for us is to decide what we do with that worry, right? I think sitting and kind of furrowing our brows and kind of, wringing our hands and saying, "Oh, this is awful," doesn't really get us anywhere. And so I think again, if there's a theme to the book, if the book accomplishes something, what I really hope it does is get readers to think about this sort of call to action. What can we do? What sorts of policies do we want to put in place? What sorts of things do we want to do that are sort of at the emergency management and sort of preventative levels in terms of preventing that sort of snowballing effect of a disaster at our community levels, at our town levels, even at our national levels? Because as I said earlier, we can't stop them from happening, but we can make them a lot less deadly.
Yeah, yeah. And so what are some of those sort of, I guess, mitigation, because it's not really full prevention, but what are some of those mitigation approaches? What did you discover as you were doing your investigation? So
there's a lot both at the macro and the micro level. And at the macro level, what we do know is that the United States infrastructure is woefully outdated. So the American Society of Civil Engineers gives our infrastructure a letter grade every 3 years, and we've consistently averaged around a D minus, which would put you at best on probation at even sort of a mid-level college or university. We're very much on probation where, if you look at, for instance, our power grid, very old, very antiquated. If you look at things like our bridges, our roads, for decades now, we've underfunded them. One of the most sort of fragile elements of our infrastructure is our levees. And that's something that most of us don't think about. And yet the overwhelming majority of Americans live within easy reach of a levee. They're inherently fragile. They're inherently unstable. And when you add a earthquake event, now all of a sudden you have an earthquake and you have rampant flooding. Most deaths associated with earthquakes actually happen as a result of fire. And that's what we saw in the Great San Francisco earthquake. Understanding that is a really important issue as well, too. So those are things as a nation we can agree to fund. And I think what's really important to recognize is that we're not just funding it because we think an earthquake might happen. We're funding it because it also makes us a more productive nation, right? If we have better roads and bridges, that's not just going to help us in an earthquake, that's going to help us in terms of commerce, it's going to help us in terms of trade, all sorts of reasons. So that's the sort of macro level picture, and that's also where I would put that early warning system. At the micro level, I think thinking as a community about issues of resilience is really important. And again, that helps us in a natural disaster. It helps us on a day-to-day basis. And then at the even smaller level, at the individual level, as a family, as a household, do we have a plan? Do we have enough supplies, both medical, food, water, to get us through, say, a week? Because what we know is that in the case of a major natural disaster, first responders may not be able to get to us for days and days. Cell phones will probably be down. Landlines certainly down. The grid may be down. So it's really going to be beholden on all of us as individuals to take care of ourselves until real help arrives. And that includes having a communication plan if we don't have the ability to call or text. How are we going to find our kids? How are our kids going to know where to meet us? How are we going to take care of our loved ones if we can't get to them? And again, that's just a good household policy to have for all sorts of reasons.
This is just reminding me of how much I need to look back in my pantry. I have a special portion of my pantry where I do keep, a couple of gallons of bottled water, and like I have an earthquake preparedness backpack. I have no idea what's in it. I think it's like some disgusting MREs and probably like a flashlight with dead battery. Like I really need to look back into this and make sure that sort of the recommended and appropriate things that you need if you are to get stranded in your home are available with no power and no water, because this is, again, I keep going back to Houston, but this is what people in Houston are dealing with. One of my very best friends, I, called him and said, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And he was like, "We're good. No, damage yet to like us, like no injuries, but we're stuck. Like I can't go outside because it's high water all around our place. We're on the second floor, so we're safe, but like we're just stuck in our house until this passes." And I was like, "Oh my God, do you have enough food?" He was like, "Yeah, we stocked up ahead of time." But what happens if an earthquake strikes? Because that does happen without warning.
Right. And where I live in the Northeast, right, we have a nor'easter come, this sort of blizzard event, and everybody goes out as soon as it starts snowing. And then you see these sort of apocryphal images on the news of these grocery stores that have no bread and have no water, right? And so we have a different kind of chaos that's created by this sort of stampede effect. Whereas if we had a backpack like you had, if we said every 6 months or even every year, we're just going to open it up and stuff a couple of energy bars in there and, some Band-Aids and a headlamp. I mean, we'd be doing a lot better than we are now. And that's a really simple thing that we can do in about 10 minutes.
It's true. And like some of this stuff expires. So it is a good idea to open up your backpack, open up your box and make sure that it's got and that it's in a place you can get to it. Don't put it behind everything, like make it actually accessible. That's probably helpful as well. And remember your growing family. Remember, do you have enough food for your new baby? Do you have formula? What about your dog? Is your dog going to be okay? Like, it's not just you. And that's, to me, that's been some of the saddest imagery coming out of Houston is like all of these like pets that are stranded or deserted.
And we saw that with Katrina, right? I mean, there were all sorts of awful, harrowing images of Katrina. But for me, some of the most painful ones were people who had to decide, they were being told by rescuers they couldn't take their pets with them. They didn't have a plan, and that was a problem that persisted for years afterwards. And so you're absolutely right. It's thinking in terms of totality of a household and making sure that the household has a plan for sort of every living creature in it.
Yeah. Oh, it's so true. And the cool thing is that this applies to many natural disasters, that each of them have their own unique, requirements, but being prepared in general means being prepared for almost anything.
Right. And, they happen all of the time, right? And no one in this country is immune. If you may live in a place with very low seismic risk, but if you do, chances are probably pretty good that either your hurricane or your tornado risk is really great there too. And it goes for other sorts of disasters as well too. It's just really this idea of sort of taking personal responsibility and making sure that, we sort of have our ducks in a row and that we're ready. And it also includes things like insurance. I was amazed at how many seismologists I talked to, including seismologists who live in California who don't have earthquake insurance.
Absolutely. I mean, being prepared means being prepared. It means being prepared for your whole family. It means being prepared for almost anything. But of course, there's some things you just can't prepare for, right? And that's sort of the nature of an earthquake is you can do everything that you can for prevention and mitigation, but you also, you just have to be ready for resiliency.
And that's that hard line to walk, right? Because we don't want to be paralyzed by fear. We don't want to sit and say, oh no, today could be the day when we have an earthquake. And, I was on a radio show earlier this week and someone called and said, I live in Portland, Oregon, but should I move? And that's not a reasonable response, right? We have city centers, we have places. And so, that's that sort of complicated thing. How much do we want to invest? How much should we want to invest in a place like, for instance, Memphis, which has the potential for a huge earthquake, has the potential to do, frankly, more sort of economic damage to us as a nation than even, for instance, an earthquake in Los Angeles, but has less likelihood of that happening than Los Angeles. So what do we do with those numbers, and how do we make the right choices for everyone?
Yeah, I mean, that's tough. And also, where is, like you mentioned, where is that line? Because I know people who are living in coastal cities with these really severe earthquakes saying, like, I want to move inland. And I'm like, I don't blame you. But at the same time, I don't want to leave LA because of the risk of an earthquake. I love LA. That would be a
And
hard
I don't want you to
decision
leave
make.
LA either.
Yeah.
So the question
Come
is, how
on.
do we make, as you said, how do we make LA earthquake resilient? How do
Yeah.
we make it so that people have water? How do we shore up the reservoirs there so we don't have this sort of tidal wave action that we've seen in past earthquakes that have, drowned entire communities? How do we prevent the idea of fire and the reality of fire, which is probably the biggest threat to LA? How do we make sure that we have enough hospital beds in the event of that fire? We're going to need burn triage units. So those are the sorts of questions to ask.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about fire as being one of the biggest sort of risks or the biggest outcomes of a severe earthquake. How does that work? Is it because of gas lines being broken? Is it because of electrical power lines going down? Like, why is fire such a big risk?
Yeah, it's for exactly those reasons that you mentioned. And when you think of all the ways that a fire can start, and certainly gas lines are one of the main ones. The electrical lines are ones as well. Even things like, pilot lights really can do it. When you think about the sheer sort of destruction that you're going to see when an earthquake happens, you're going to have those gas lines break. You're going to have, for instance, things in your house that are breaking. You're going to have sort of electrical things that are coming apart. And then, once a fire starts, then there's the question of, okay, now the fire department can't get to it, can't contain it, right? And so what could have been a simple house fire then becomes a neighborhood fire, becomes a community level fire, and then, becomes this sort of insurmountable thing that in some cases is just going to have to burn itself out.
Oof. Yeah, that's to me, that's probably the scariest part. It's one thing to be stranded. It's one thing to be isolated. It's another thing to have an incredibly pressing, dangerous situation that you cannot correct on your own, that you require, personnel to come take care of.
And the idea that the rubble, right? Even for instance, a moderate earthquake in New York City, the one that's overdue, is probably going to create more rubble than the September 11th tragedy did. And when you think about that rubble all over the city, you have impassable roads, you have impassable streets. And so then that again comes to this idea of you mentioned this idea of sort of being trapped. And that's again where it's up to us to think well, what are our alternate routes? Where could we go? How could we solve this problem? And again, that's that kind of place where I think some forward-thinking action can really kind of keep us from that place of despair and get us to this place of thinking, we feel prepared, we have a plan, we have contingencies, we're ready.
That's true. It really is empowering to know that you've kind of done everything that you can and you are ready and you are prepared, especially in the wake of tragedies when you're seeing so many individuals who, weren't necessarily prepared and weren't ready and who are really suffering these just horrific consequences. And I think one thing that's really sort of, I don't know, promising, positive, makes me optimistic is that as a nation, we are always ready to step up. Like seeing just the vast quantity of donations that are pouring in to Houston right now, and seeing these news stories where I just retweeted one this morning where it was like a line of people going all the way down a block, and it was like, do you think this line is for food? Is it for medicine? No, it's just people who are lining up to volunteer, and it just brought tears to my eyes when I saw it.
And I love everything about that. And I love that generosity of spirit of our nation. And I don't want to do anything to change it. But the question I would ask is, why are we not doing that on the front end of a disaster?
Yeah.
Why are we not
Good
lining
point.
up to volunteer to shore up a levee? Why are we not lining up to volunteer as a community to do a walking assessment of our most vulnerable structures? Why are we not standing up to volunteer to create a system of sort of a neighborhood phone tree to make sure that we can check in on one another? And I think that idea of that sort of, I think we lack imagination as a nation. When we see the images of devastation, yes, we are so ready to step up and help. But I think as a nation, if we don't have those images in front of us, it's difficult for us to conceive why we would need to be volunteering. And that's something that I think we really can work on. It's a pretty big social and cultural paradigm shift, but it's one that absolutely has to happen, especially in this face of changing climates, changing weather, induced earthquakes. It's time for us really to sit down and say, what if? And have an answer on the front end to that question.
It's true. I think that it's deeply entrenched in our culture that we are really into the right now. We're really into the next 5 minutes. I think it might be partially linked to the way that we do election cycles in this culture and the way that our political leaders don't often make plans for posterity because it's not in service sort of to their new election. And when we do have political leaders who do that, who are like, we're going to set this up for 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line for our children's children, it's almost like, what? That's weird. Or like, it's like weirdly refreshing because it's so uncommon. And I mean, I don't want to say it fully trickles down to us because I'm sure there's some bottom up stuff happening too, but just as a nation and as this kind of individualist society, yeah, that has never really been our strong suit, is planning for the future, has it?
It's true, and I don't want to make this an oversimplification, but, we really, in a lot of ways, we've created a disposable culture, It's a culture of sort of, particle board furniture instead of oak furniture. And it's it's a use a bottle once and then throw it away or recycle it culture, and I think this idea of investing on the front end is something that we've really lost sight of. We want that sort of easy, cheap fix now, even if it ends up costing us more when we're done.
Yeah. It's, it's so silly. I think we're just, as evolved creatures, as human beings, we have all of these cognitive biases and we have all of these errors in thinking that made sense or make sense from an evolutionary perspective, right? Like we see things on a human scale. So we understand measurements that are relevant to us, but we don't understand, micro measurements or cosmic measurements very readily. And for that same kind of reason, we are just not good at risk analysis. Like we will be crazy paranoid about things that like never happen. And then things that are a legitimate concern, we're like, we'll deal with it when it comes.
And, I'm so glad you mentioned that because, that began as a pet project for me during Superstorm Sandy and the book Superstorm, and then very much carried through in this book. And with Superstorm, I was so interested in this idea that so few people left. So we had the Bounty, this old wooden ship that decided to sail directly into the storm. We had New York City and Mayor Bloomberg saying, don't bother evacuating, it's going to be fine. And I kept thinking, why did all of these people underestimate the potential that this superstorm posed? And I asked that question of risk analysis experts, people who study this for a living. And what they said to me was, if you ask the average American what is their greatest risk on a daily basis, that they will tell you that it's nuclear disaster and terrorist attack, neither of which rank even in the top 10. And yet this idea of, for instance, a car accident, a sudden heart attack, a natural disaster, all of which infinitely more likely, it's just not on our radar screen. And that's true for all natural disasters. And one really big question I have is why is this? Why do we have such a blind spot for these disasters, even in, for instance, Tornado Alley, where we know they're going to happen, right? It's unavoidable. And yet we still have this, I don't know, maybe hubris where we say, but not to us, and then we can kind of go on with our day. And then meanwhile, we're terrified that, a nuclear power plant is going to melt down.
I know. It's just, we literally think ISIS is going to attack like Nebraska, or that like if I go swimming, I'm going to get eaten by a shark. And you're like, no, that doesn't happen. But I'm not concerned about, disease carrying mosquito. It's just, it makes no sense. It makes no sense. We have the worst capability of ranking what is actually a risk to us. And I think reading about it more often and reading books like yours are, just endlessly helpful for really sort of calibrating the way that we think about these things, because a lot of it is just the fact that we don't think about it often enough. It's the fact that we don't, it's not in the forefront of our minds. And it takes a big disaster like Hurricane Harvey to bring it back into everybody's consciousness. And then they may be really, really mindful of it for like a week or two and then completely forget again, which is a bummer. And again, like you said, that fine line between being prepared and being paralyzed by fear, we don't want that by any stretch. But I do think it's quite empowering to be prepared. I want to ask you, I'm so excited because, I just love pure journalism and I love brilliant science journalism. And I love it when people get their hands dirty learning about these stories so that they can share them with everybody else. How was the journey for you of traveling around, of talking to locals and of talking to experts to get a good handle on earthquakes? Did you know a lot before you started, or was this all kind of new?
Most of it was new. Most of it was very new. And it was initially a very steep learning curve. And as I say in the acknowledgments to the book, it was entirely because of the benevolence and incredible patience of these very talented scientists who are willing to sit down and really just kind of give me a primer on geology in some cases so that I understood. And they took days to do that, which was wonderful. And then once I felt like I had that sort of basic knowledge, once I knew, for instance, that there is no Richter scale and I should stop saying Richter scale and things like that, then I could sort of...
Oh, wow, I had no idea.
Then I could sort of sophisticate it. And for me, the absolute best part of writing this book and the absolute best part of my job is this idea of participatory journalism that, if you know the James Thurber story, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, that I get to go have this secret life where I live the life of a silver miner. I live the life of a dam worker. I live the life of, someone who's setting off earthquakes in a lab. And I really get to see what that life looks like and what their world looks like. And then hopefully get to tell that to readers and say, hey, look at these fascinating people, some of them who are really weird and wacky, and they're doing really weird and wacky things. And isn't this interesting? That's a real gift of this job.
Yeah, that's so cool. That's so cool. And so where did you go? Did you travel like just coast to coast across the US? Did you go down, I don't know, like to my home, to the heartland? Did you leave America during your journey?
So we decided to make this an America-focused book just because, it would be really easy to write volumes and volumes and volumes on the subject. And so I do talk about historic global quakes. And I do make some comparisons to, for instance, a quake in Chile and what that would look like here, or what we've learned from it. But the actual sort of narrative focus of the book is literally a road trip around America, which I took over the course of a year. Put a ton of miles on a couple of different rental cars and had a ton of fun and found these surprising places, these surprising hotbeds of seismic activity that are of real concern. Like, for instance, Salt Lake City, like the greater Memphis area, like Nevada, like, a surprising number of places on the eastern seaboard. And so driving there, understanding the culture, understanding what's happening there, understanding what would be different about, say, an earthquake in Washington and one in San Francisco. How would they literally manifest themselves differently? And what would be the after effect in those sorts of places?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. I mean, especially like you said, you live in the Northeast, right? Are you in the New York area?
I actually live in Portland, Maine. And
okay.
What's really interesting to me is we know that there are about 2,100 known faults in the United States. The overwhelming majority of those faults are west of the Mississippi, not because there are more faults necessarily west of the Mississippi, but that's because where our research has been focused. And, what the USGS says to us is there's probably 10 times as many faults, but we just don't know where they are. And if you look at every significant earthquake that's happened in the United States, it's happened on a fault that we didn't know about prior to that earthquake. And not only do we not know a lot about the faults in places like California and the Pacific Northwest, but, the USGS folks say, look, if you really want to get freaked out, keep in mind that we know next to nothing about the Northeast. We very recently discovered a major fault that lies just north of New York City, capable of a significant earthquake, and it's right underneath a nuclear power plant. So we don't know what's happening in this area, and we also know that this area is changing dramatically. It's only now starting to react to glaciers that happened tens of thousands of years ago. So it's this moving target, that seismologists are working with. And that's part of why, for instance, every few years, the USGS issues brand new earthquake maps, brand new seismological predictions. And we see a fair amount of variance from 2 years to 2 years because of that research that's happening and that sort of quest to better understand what's happening underneath the ground.
That's fascinating. Why do you think it is that historically we just kind of thought all the earthquakes and all the faults were on the West Coast? Like, why has that part, the Northeast, been historically just sort of ignored?
Probably because it is true that the rate at which earthquakes happen in the West is more significant, and the magnitude of the earthquakes happening in the West, certainly in the time that we've settled the nation, have been greater. And so it certainly seemed like a logical thing to do. And it is,
Gotcha.
I mean, for instance,
so we just didn't think to look there.
I mean, for instance, scholars will tell you that they have the closest thing possible to complete certainty that there will be at least a moderate earthquake in Southern California in the next 30 years. And they say, look, 99.9% sure that this is probably going to happen, right? They cannot say that about the East Coast, in part because they don't know, and in part because, for instance, I mentioned that moderate quake in New York. That's on a 100-year return rate. We had next to no sort of seismic monitoring happening in the Northeast when the last one happened. Certainly, we didn't have anything for the one before. So we don't really know. And when we have limited resources, we have to make tough choices about where we're going to place them.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's the thing that we forget sometimes is that science, costs money, and it costs a lot of hours of individuals working really hard to collect this data, to analyze this data, and make it available in models that are readable for the general public. And there's only so much tax money that to go around, and we're trying to allocate our resources to the things that we think are the most important. And sometimes this kind of research does not make the cut, unfortunately, kind of because of some of those cognitive biases that we were talking about earlier.
And it's sort of the opposite of the not in my backyard, right? It's the sort of please, please, please in my backyard. So say for instance, that we chose to create 5 new tsunami monitoring stations as a country. Where would we put them? Mm-hmm. I mean, the places most likely to have a tsunami monitoring station are the coast of Alaska and the coast of Hawaii, but those are not population centers. So do we put them there? Do we put them outside of Seattle? We've seen, real historic evidence of tsunami activities in places like the Gulf of Maine. Do we put them there? That definitely wouldn't be people's first thought. And yet I wouldn't mind one here, but I would probably have a hard time justifying it to someone living where you live. So those are those sorts of questions, again, of like that risk, that sort of utilitarian idea of the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And are we okay with that line of thinking when we make these decisions?
And is that even a reasonable line of thinking when, like, we're talking about practicality and not sort of this fantastic thinking of, we're all on a level playing field and, like you said, the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. But the truth of the matter is that politics doesn't work that way, generally speaking. And individual governors, individual senators, individual congressmen and women are going to petition for their constituents, and based on the amount of influence that they have, they may be able to get that petition through. The funding may go to the places where, maybe it's because they make the best argument for it, but maybe it's because they owe each other favors or they have the best relationships or all the other reasons that things happen across the country. It's just never as clean and as clear as we want it to be.
And that's part of why I'm really interested in a lot of the sort of citizen science and sort of crowdsourcing that's happening when it comes to seismic research. And one of the most interesting things I discovered in researching the book was some really interesting applications that are happening with cell phone technology coming out of UC Berkeley. And their scholars are realizing that they can take this thing called an accelerometer in our phones. And they're the things that sort of know whether to put it in portrait or landscape, kind of know which way our phone is oriented. That same technology registers seismic activity. And as it turns out, it distinguishes seismic activity from, say, you jumping up and down and shaking your phone. And so with a very simple app, that anonymizes who you are and where you are. It can record that data and track earthquakes and become its own early warning system. And that's particularly valuable in places like, for instance, New York City, that doesn't have that sort of, seismic intensive sort of study happening. And in places like Nepal, that has next to no sort of seismic instrumentation, but where millions of people have a smartphone. And those are the sorts of things, I think, that let us step away from the politics, let us step away from those ideas of congressional funding, and really allow innovation and allow visionary thinking solve multiple problems at the same time.
Oh my gosh. In the amount of time that you told me about that, I have downloaded the UC Berkeley Earthquake app. I'm so excited to participate in this. And I love that this conversation about citizen science continues to come up on my show week after week. I just had Mary Ellen Hannibal on the show to talk about her new book, Citizen Scientist. And so we talked a lot about citizen science, more from an ecological extinct species perspective, but definitely we talked about all of the other ways that we can participate and how cool that you can contribute to this earthquake research. I'm especially because I'm in LA, I want to help, that you can contribute, but you also will get ultimately downstream some incredible protections and some incredible feedback from that.
And there are more out there. For instance, the USGS has a program called Did You Feel It? Right? And so if you do feel an earthquake, even if it did just feel like a subway car under your building, you can log on to usgs.gov and tell them what you felt. And there's this really great sort of intensity scale that allows you to kind of locate your subjective experience within some sort of empirical sort of objectivity. So did you hear your dishes rattle? Did any of those dishes break? Did a chair get knocked over? And by answering those sorts of questions, you can tell them a ton. Even just taking, for instance, if you use Weather Underground as your weather app, a lot of times it'll say to you, is it actually raining there? And taking that 1 second to say yes or no is sophisticating this science and this prediction in ways that really benefit all of us.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's so cool that I know I've used that word now, empowering, multiple times throughout this episode, but it really is. It's so empowering to know that just you with your, the thing that this computer that you hold in your pocket and your own observations can really contribute. And we need the observations of hundreds or thousands or millions of people, like you said, to sophisticate that algorithm and that data analysis, because we all experience these things differently. I remember just a couple years ago, I had an apartment with a roommate, and I came home one day and she was on all fours on the floor and the dogs were huddled under her, and she was like, did you feel that? And I was like, nah, dude, I have no idea what you're talking about, because I was walking up the stairs, or I was in an elevator, I was driving home and in the parking structure, and I don't have shake sense. This I have learned over the past few years living here. I don't feel it ever, but other people do, and so it's important for us all to kind of chime in and talk about it. I often find myself in the middle of the night, not often, but I periodically find myself in the middle of the night going on Twitter and being like, was there an earthquake? I don't know if that's what I just felt. I don't think so. But other people will be like, yeah, I think there was an earthquake.
And seismologists are using Twitter. We've used Twitter to sort of track the spread of the flu, and we're also using Twitter. And they can even look at the timestamps on when people are tweeting and do that same they can sort of even start to triangulate where the epicenter of the earthquake was based on when people were tweeting. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's so cool. And the truth, we're doing it anyway. That's the thing. Anybody who lives in this area who's used to a little bit of shaking under the ground, they are already getting on Twitter in the middle of the night being like, wait, was that an earthquake? I just want to make sure. I live alone and I can't tell. But if other people are saying it, then they know it is. So it's so cool that sort of this activity that's, I don't know, human nature that we're already engaging in is contributing so much to science. So unfortunately, guys, at this point in the interview, which, tends to happen from time to time, Kate and I got disconnected and weren't able to reconnect to finish. I was just moving on. I actually have my recordings of my side, which don't match up to hers, saying, okay, I want to start with the last 2 questions. And of course, we just weren't able to reconnect. So I want to make sure for Kathryn that I mention exactly where you can find her on social media, and I remind you a little bit about her book. So let's see here. I asked her to send me all of that info, and here it is. You can find her at Kathryn_Miles on Twitter, and I will make sure to link out to that in the show notes. And one more time, guys, the book is called Quakeland, On the Road to America's Next Devastating Earthquake. I highly, highly recommend you check it out. And of course, I've linked to that in the show notes as well. I want to thank one more time Kathryn Miles for joining me. It was such an informative and enlightening chat. And I want to thank all of you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.